Now, etiology means that which causes. The etiological factors in a disease are factors that can lead to the development of that disease. So if someone starts off by being healthy, they're subject to etiological or causative factors, and as a result of this they develop disease. And of course, prevention is always better than cure. It's much better if we can prevent a disease process than treat it or cure that disease process once it has developed. So let's think about the etiology of cancer. What is causing cancer in the people that we're working with and the people we come across? Well, I think the first thing probably to think about is that cancer is a mutation. Now, a mutation is a change to the genetic material of the cell. That is the genes and the chromosomes. And the genes are made up of DNA, the deoxyribonucleic acid. So in this sense, cancer is a genetic disease. Not that it's necessarily inherited, but in that it's a disease of the genetic material of the cell, the genes and the chromosomes. So if something goes wrong with the genetic apparatus of a cell, and that leads to a hyperplasia, an overgrowth of the cells. Now normally there's some mitosis in cells, there's some ongoing cell division, but in cancer that's going to be accelerated. There's an out of control mitosis. There is a pathological proliferation of cells giving rise to a tumour. So that starts in the genetic material of the cell. So really the etiology of cancer, the question could be, well, what causes mutations to cells? What is it that damages cells? Particularly, what damages the genetic apparatus inside cells? And the first one, and the obvious one to think about, is chemical carcinogens. Now, gen or genesis means beginning, so a carcinogen or a carcinogen is something which will begin the process of cancer. So a chemical carcinogen is a chemical that someone is exposed to, and as a result of exposure, possibly on one occasion with some carcinogens, or more likely over many occasions with different carcinogens, a cancer will develop as a result of exposure to that carcinogenic chemical. And tar was the first one to be discovered. Some guy got some poor mouse and shaved the hair off its back and applied coats of tar to it every day. And after a period of time, the mouse developed cancer, skin cancer, as a result of exposure to the tar, meaning that it was the tar that caused the cancer. When human tissues or any animal tissues are exposed to tar repeatedly, then the tar acts as a carcinogen and cancers can develop. And of course there's tar in tobacco smoke. This is why smoking is carcinogenic, why it causes cancer. So smokers get more cancer in the mouth, in the pharynx and in the nose, nasal cancers, because smoke goes into all these areas. People don't smoke pipes as much in this country anymore, in England anymore. Not as much as they used to anyway. But in the old days people used to smoke pipes quite a lot. And pipe smokers often used to leave the pipe in their mouth when they weren't smoking. It was like a permanent fixture in the mouth. And the tar residues on the outside of the pipe were in constant contact with their lips. And that meant that they used to get lip cancer. But in the mouth, the pharynx, the nasal passages, the smoke is in contact with the lining tissues, with the epithelium of those structures. And as the smoke is inhaled down to the lungs, it comes into contact, direct, intimate contact, with the respiratory mucosa, the mucous membrane lining the respiratory tract. And this is why it gives rise to a carcinoma. A carcinoma describes a cancer which arises from an epithelial tissue. So as a result of inhaling tobacco smoke, you can develop a bronchogenic carcinoma, a carcinoma which begins within the bronchial passage, or the bronchial passages. And I think pretty well everyone knows that now, that's common knowledge. But what is less common knowledge is that carcinogens from cigarette smoke or tobacco smoke, when it's inhaled, the carcinogens go into the blood and circulate around the body in the blood. So as well as having carcinogens in body tissues which are directly exposed to the tobacco smoke, there's also systemic absorption, meaning that essentially all of the organs of the body are exposed to carcinogens from tobacco smoke. For example, smokers are much more prone to getting pancreatic cancer than non-smokers. Someone who smokes has probably got a 20-25% greater chance of getting pancreatic cancer than their identical twin who didn't smoke, if such a study was carried out. But it's about 20-25% increase in risk in pancreatic cancer. So if you'd like to increase your risk of pancreatic cancer by 20 or 25%, then start smoking, and that will do that, because of the absorbed toxins circulating around in the blood, and of course the blood is going through the pancreas. And then it's the kidneys that filter toxins out of the blood. So the kidneys actually concentrate carcinogenic toxins. So the kidneys are more prone to cancer in people that smoke. And once the urine has been made by the kidneys and the kidneys have filtered out the carcinogenic substances, then these carcinogenic substances are going to be concentrated in the urine. And the urine can lie in the bladder for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, who knows, 8 or 9 hours overnight. And all the time that the urine containing the carcinogens is in contact with the bladder wall, that's increasing the chance that you will get a so-called transitional cell carcinoma. The transitional epithelium lining the bladder can develop a carcinoma as a result of exposure to these carcinogens, because the person smoked these carcinogens into their systemic circulation. Now, sometimes it's useful to distinguish between direct and indirect carcinogens. What do these terms mean? Well, a direct carcinogen is a chemical which will cause cancer straight away as soon as a body tissue is exposed to that carcinogen. Dioxins, for example, are in this category. Dioxins are very nasty carcinogens. They've been used in chemical warfare in Vietnam, when there was a lot of jungles sprayed by Agent Orange to defoliate the jungles, but it contained dioxins, and that caused birth defects and cancers in the Vietnamese and Cambodian people that were affected by that spraying. Benzene is another direct carcinogen. Sometimes you can smell that when you're filling your car with petrol. It's not good to sniff too much of it because it contains some benzene as a volatile component of the petrol. So direct carcinogens can cause cancer straight away when their body tissue is exposed to them. Oh, actually, I meant to say that dioxins are also produced when you burn plastics. So inhaling burnt plastic fumes is a remarkably bad idea. I remember when I was a young staff nurse, we used to burn the clinical waste out the back of the hospital. We used to take bags of it out and burn it, and it was low temperature incineration, so the medical plastics, we would burn them, and then the smoke would just float over the town. So while we were treating people in the hospital, we were probably causing cases of cancer in the community by burning plastics at low temperatures, letting the dioxins go into the atmosphere around about. We've stopped doing that now, I'm very thankful to say. We now send it away for high temperature incineration. High temperature incineration is much safer because the temperatures are much greater, therefore there's much greater molecular vibration in the smoke, so the molecules, the dioxin molecules, are shaken apart by the incineration process as long as the temperature is high enough. An indirect carcinogen is a chemical which becomes a carcinogen after it's been metabolically processed in the body. So, example, in Africa people sometimes eat mouldy peanuts because they're hungry, and the mould contains a toxin called aflatoxin. But aflatoxin is not carcinogenic until it's been processed by the liver. But when it's been processed by the liver, the metabolic breakdowns of the aflatoxin are carcinogenic and can cause liver cancer, for example. So direct and indirect carcinogens or carcinogens. Now, initiation and promotion. Some carcinogens will initiate a pre-malignant change in the genetics of the cell. It's like a mutation, but it's not enough to cause cancer in its own right. But what it does mean is that cancer has the potential to develop in the future. A potential carcinogenic change has been initiated by prone to an initiating carcinogen. And because this maybe happened way back in the past, 10, 20, 30, 40 years before the patient developed the cancer, it's very often quite difficult to identify what these initiating carcinogens are. But this is the theory, that it makes a potential cancer. It brings about a change which can become cancer in the future. And what determines whether an initiated mutation will develop into a cancer or not depends on whether the person is exposed to a promoter. And a promoting carcinogen is just that. It's something which promotes malignant change in a tissue. And what typically happens is that the person is exposed to the promoter on many occasions, perhaps over many, many years. For example, peptic juice can go back into the esophagus in a condition called gastroesophageal reflux disease, giving chronic heartburn. And that chronic gastroesophageal reflux can cause what's called a metaplasia in the tissues of the esophagus. There's a change in the cell type of the esophagus. And we sometimes call this a Barrett esophagus. There's a metaplasia predisposing to malignant change. And then malignant change can develop in this metaplastic tissue. But it's promoted by the constant washing over of the peptic juice, which contains pepsin and hydrochloric acid, which of course are very irritating. So constant exposure to these substances promotes the cancer. I suppose you could include chronic inflammation in this category. Any tissue which is chronically inflamed is more likely to develop cancer in the future. So we can see this in patients with chronic leg ulcers, where there's a chronic inflammation over many years because of the presence of some infection and the presence of the leg ulcer, and this can lead to malignant change within the ulcer. Or patients with chronic pancreatitis, even though the condition can be quite low grade, but because it's inflamed over many years, that's going to very significantly increase the chances that the patient will get pancreatic cancer in the future. So I suppose you could include chronic inflammation there. Drinking strong alcohol, drinking spirits, will increase the chances of upper esophageal cancer, especially if the patient smokes as well. But again, it's when the esophagus is exposed to these over months, years and decades that the cancer is promoted. Cigarette smoke really is a promoting carcinogen, because if someone stops smoking at an early enough stage, over about a 20-year period, their chances of getting lung cancer will go back down almost to that of a non-smoker, depending on how long they smoke for and what age they stopped at. That's why the earlier someone can stop smoking, the better, because you're taking away the promoter. Now, some carcinogens are described as complete carcinogens. This is because they're capable of initiating and promoting, and dioxins that we mentioned before are in that category. They're capable of initiating and promoting cancer, bringing about malignant change. Let's now think about free radical theory. Free radicals are highly reactive molecules that are generated inside cells as a result of metabolic processes inside those cells. So the more metabolic processing there is going on inside a cell, the more likely it is that free radicals are going to be generated. And one way to increase metabolism inside cells is to eat too much. So by constantly overeating, you're going to get more metabolic activity in many cells, and that can increase free radical formation. And the free radicals are molecules which will oxidize other molecules. They are capable of oxidizing because they are unstable chemicals. They are waste products. And one of the tissues, or one of the chemicals that the free radicals can oxidize, is the DNA itself. So if a free radical comes along to a DNA molecule and oxidizes that DNA molecule, can you see that means it's no longer a DNA molecule, it becomes a DNA oxide. It's now DNA plus oxygen. And that means there's actually been a change to the DNA molecule. And if there's a change to a gene or a chromosome, remembering that genes are made up of DNA molecules, then that is a mutation. In other words, free radicals can cause mutation, and some mutations can give rise to cancer. So this gives rise to the idea that we need to reduce the amount of free radicals inside cells. So eating less can be beneficial, exercise can be beneficial, and also a lot of theory suggests that giving antioxidants to scavenge and mop up the free radicals is also a good idea. Now, to be fair, this makes a lot of sense in theory, but there's not a great deal of clinical trial evidence for this. But the idea is that the antioxidants mop up the free radicals, reducing the amounts of free radicals knocking around inside the cells. It reduces the level of intracellular free radicals. So vitamin C is antioxidant. In fact, all the ACE vitamins are antioxidant, vitamins A, C and E. And selenium is antioxidant. Selenium is a trace element, and it's quite antioxidant, so it's a good thing to have some of. And also, flavonoids are antioxidant. Now, what are flavonoids? Well, flavonoids are chemicals made inside plants, and they are antioxidant, therefore they're very good for us. This is one reason why eating at least 5 portions of fruit and vegetables a day is very strongly recommended. In fact, if you could eat more than 5 portions a day, that would be even more beneficial. And the flavonoids are present in the coloured part of fruit and vegetables. So red tomatoes are high in flavonoids, red berries are high in flavonoids, dark green vegetables are high in flavonoids, purple sprouting broccoli is going to be high in flavonoids, bright coloured peppers are going to be high in flavonoids. It's in the coloured part of the food. This is why red wine is better for you than white wine, because the red wine contains flavonoids from the red grape skins. The flavonoids are in the colour. This is why it's often suggested that we should eat a rainbow, eat as many different colours of food, as many different colours of fruit and vegetables as possible, because that's giving you lots of different flavonoids, and the flavonoids will mop up the free radicals. Now, the degree to which this is true doesn't matter too much, because we know from large-scale clinical trials that people that do eat a lot of fruit and vegetables are protected from lots and lots of different sorts of cancers. Many, many different types of cancers are reduced or prevented by eating plenty of fruit and vegetables. We know they're protective. And this is one mechanism by which they probably are protective, the flavonoids mopping up these nasty free radicals. Now, radiation is an obvious risk for cancer. Ionising radiation will go through tissues of the body. And what ionising radiation will do, it can do 2 things. First of all, the radiation can bump into a DNA molecule and physically damage the DNA molecule as it goes through a cell. And if it physically damages the DNA molecule, then that means that that DNA molecule has been changed. It's a type of mutation, isn't it? There's a change to the DNA molecule. And the other thing that radiation will do is, as the radiation passes through cells, it will cause the formation of free radicals in the cell. So after a cell's been irradiated, there's going to be more free radicals inside that cell, and we've already noted that free radicals can oxidize DNA, causing mutation. So radiation can cause mutation directly or indirectly. So radiation should be avoided, or excess radiation should be avoided. Now, there's radiation in the environment all the time, and we are designed to cope with that. DNA does have repair mechanisms to cope with background radiation. But when the amount of radiation is increased significantly, the normal DNA repair mechanisms can be overwhelmed, and damages to the DNA molecule can be preserved. So too much X-rays, for example, is a source of radiation. Or if there's leaks from nuclear power stations, that can be a cause of radiation. After the Chernobyl disaster, for example, lots of radioactive iodine was released into the atmosphere, and people consumed that radioactive iodine. The radioactive iodine was concentrated in the thyroid gland, That meant that this radioactive iodine was releasing radiation while it was in the thyroid gland of the people that had been exposed to it, and that caused an epidemic of thyroid cancer. Or after nuclear explosions, there's something called fallout. Now, what happens with a nuclear explosion is huge amounts of material are sucked up into the air, and you get a big column of material, superheated material going up into the air, and then it forms a mushroom cloud as it starts to cool and it starts falling back down to Earth. As it falls back down to Earth, that means that lots of radioactive material from the ground, soil or whatever it is from the ground, now radioactive, contaminated with radioactive elements from the bomb, start falling out onto the ground. So anyone downwind can be exposed to that fallout. And after the nuclear explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course many people were killed by the explosion. Then many people died of acute radiation poisoning, and then in the 10 years, even the 20, 30 years after the explosion, many more thousands of people died from the malignant effects of the carcinogenic exposure to the radiation. Some areas have naturally high areas of radiation, and this can collect in cellars. It's sometimes, in some areas particularly, it's called radon gas. So if you live in a high radon gas area, make sure that you ventilate your cellars, although that's fairly well known about now in the UK anyway. It tends to occur in areas where there's a lot of granite, because granite contains radioactive elements that decay slowly over time. Ultraviolet radiation is a form of radiation, of course, and although it won't go through the body, it will be filtered out by the skin. It can irradiate the skin, and if it's associated with burning, if there's excessive exposure, then that can lead to cancers such as malignant melanoma, as the melanocytes can be affected by the radiation passing through them. A malignant melanoma is quite an aggressive cancer. It can metastasize at an early stage. So prevent sunburn, and that will help to prevent malignant melanoma, especially in children. We don't want to get our children sunburnt. The rhyme here is kids cook quick. We don't want them to get sunburnt. Now, this doesn't mean we don't want them to be exposed to sunshine at all. We probably do, because that helps them to create vitamin D, and vitamin D is very protective against quite a few diseases. But we don't want them to get burnt. That's the key thing. Avoid sunburn. Now, here's an interesting question for you. Can you catch cancer? Interesting idea. Well, the answer basically is no, but having said that, there are such things as oncogenic viruses. Now, onco means to do with cancer and tumours, like oncology is the study of cancer. So an oncogenic virus is a virus which can cause tumour formation, and as well as viruses and bacteria. Let's think of viruses first. One classic example is the hepatitis B virus. If someone is infected with hepatitis B over a long period of time, if there's chronic hepatitis B infection, that person is at significantly increased risk of developing liver cancer, so-called hepatocellular carcinoma. The hepatocytes are the functional cells of the liver. And also chronic infection with hepatitis C will do the same thing. Now, to be quite honest, I don't know whether it's the effect of the virus that leads to the cancer or whether it's the chronic low-grade inflammation that the viruses cause that can lead to the cancer. But either way, if someone's got chronic infection with hepatitis B or C, they are much more likely to develop hepatocellular carcinoma. Another one, unfortunately, you're probably going to come across is human papillomavirus, HPV. And human papillomavirus is sexually transmitted. So a woman can catch HPV infection, human papillomavirus, from a male sexual partner. And the human papillomavirus can cause chronic inflammation in the cervix. And nearly all cases of cervical carcinoma, I don't know what the percentage is, probably 90% or more of cases of cervical carcinoma are attributable to infection with human papillomavirus. Human papillomavirus is by far the most significant cause of cervical cancer. This is why we're now vaccinating our young girls against human papilloma virus. But the problem is, I think there's about 70 different types of HPV, and we're only vaccinating against 2 or 3 of those, I think. So, yeah, it's good. We're vaccinating against the most common types, but that doesn't mean that the risk is reduced to 0, because now we're vaccinating against some types of human papilloma virus, which is good. The other types of human papilloma virus will probably become more prevalent, unfortunately. So don't think the vaccine is going to prevent it altogether. It's just going to reduce it, but hopefully reduce it by quite a lot, and hopefully for quite a long period of time. And also, I've just learned recently that there's more human papilloma virus causing cancer of the esophagus as a result of oral sexual exposure. So in this case, there's oral sex taking place. Some of the viruses will be swallowed, and that can colonise the esophagus, causing the human papilloma to colonise the esophagus. But I don't know much about that because I've only heard about it in the past few weeks, but it's one to keep an eye out for as more research and epidemiology comes in on that condition. So, viruses leading to chronic inflammation, and whether it's the virus or the chronic inflammation causing cancer, it doesn't matter too much, because we know that it's the presence of the virus, one way or another, that's leading to the carcinogenesis. And bacteria as well. Helicobacter pylori can cause chronic colonisation in the stomach and in the duodenum. And people with chronic Helicobacter pylori infection are more prone to developing gastric cancer as well. Although fortunately, I've never ever come across a case of duodenal cancer. It basically doesn't seem to go malignant, the duodenum. I've never heard of it. But the stomach certainly does become malignant on a fairly regular basis, unfortunately. So Helicobacter pylori can cause gastric cancer. And while it doesn't cause cancer in the duodenum, it certainly can give rise to duodenal ulceration. Let's think now about cancer and immunity. Now, it could be that people develop cancer quite regularly, but hopefully don't get the disease because the immune system becomes aware of it and eradicates the cell, and the cell which has become malignant. And this is quite possible. So it could well be that the natural killer, the NK or the large lymphocytes, are killing cancer cells, and the cytotoxic T lymphocytes are also possibly killing cells which become malignant as well, if the immune system recognises them. And if this thinking is true, that means that it's only the cells that the immune system does not recognise as being malignant which go on to develop pathological and clinical cases of cancer. But people that are immunocompromised for long periods of time are more prone to developing cancer. Patients with HIV, for example, can develop one called Kaposi's sarcoma. And people that take long-term immunosuppressing drugs as a result of organ transplantation, they also become more prone to developing some cancers. So a general principle is that someone with a good immune system is less likely to develop cancers than people with a less efficient immune system. That sounds a reasonable statement. Now let's think about cancer and hormones. Now, what hormones do, in some cases, let's take estrogen for example. Estrogen will stimulate mitosis in breast tissue. And the more cell division, the more mitosis there is in breast tissue, the more opportunity there is for a mistake to occur and for malignancy to develop. So people that take estrogen after the menopause is very good for preventing osteoporosis, but they are more prone to developing breast cancer. And testosterone is the same. Testosterone will stimulate cell division in the prostate gland in a man, again making prostate cancer more likely. And if we can find out what's causing these cancers, anything to do with breast and prostate cancer, let's work on that, because breast cancer is the most common cancer in the UK, despite the fact that not many men are affected. It nearly always affects women. Prostate cancer is the most common single malignancy diagnosed in men. So these are common cancers. Cancer and age is the next heading. Let's think about cancer and age. Now, fortunately, most cancers develop in older people. The longer someone lives, the more probable it is they will develop cancer. In fact, if you live long enough, you're almost certainly going to develop cancer. It's been said that 70 or 80% of men in their 80s have prostate cancer, but they'll die of something else. But this means that 80% of men are probably developing prostate cancer by the time they're in their late 80s. So if you live long enough, you'll get cancer, although you may not die of cancer because you might die of something else first. So generally, cancer becomes more common with age. And I suppose that's good because it means that young people aren't dying of cancer. But there are exceptions. Lymphocytic leukemia, for example, is more common in children, whereas older people tend to get more of the myeloid form of leukemia. The peak age for young men developing testicular carcinoma is around about 30 years old. So someone who develops testicular cancer will typically develop it in their 20s or their 30s. So this is highly significant, fortunately not because it's a very common cancer, but because it occurs at a young age. And there's certain paediatric cancers that occur in children as well. Some of these paediatric cancers that develop in children are actually caused by the fact that the father smokes when he's making the sperm. So if a man's trying to conceive, trying to start a family, if he smokes, then he's going to take carcinogens into his blood, as we've discussed before, and these carcinogens are going to circulate around his testes, and they can mutate some of the sperms as they form. That means there's a possibility the mum's ovum will form a zygote that will be fertilised with a sperm which already has a mutation in it, and that can greatly increase the probability that that child will get cancer. So we're very keen on telling mums not to smoke when they're pregnant or before they're trying to get pregnant, and rightly so. But what much less emphasis is put on is that dads should not smoke when they're having unprotected sex, because there's a possibility that a child will be formed. Or especially if they're trying to start a family, it's absolutely vital that men don't smoke, because if they do smoke when they're making the sperm that produces the child, that child is going to be more prone to developing paediatric cancer with all the tragic consequences of that disease. And the last point on this podcast is genetic factors. It's been known for a while that cancers do tend to run in some families. Some families get different types of cancer more commonly than other families. Not necessarily one type of cancer, it can be different types of cancer. And now there are some specific genes which predispose to cancer that have been identified. So for example, there's the BRCA gene, the BRCA, BR breast, CA cancer, breast cancer gene, BRCA genes 1 and BRCA genes 2, two types of gene, BRCA1 and BRCA2. And these genes greatly predispose women to the development of breast cancer and ovarian cancer. So a woman who has a BRCA gene has got something like an 80% chance of developing breast cancer during her life. And the same gene will also confer something like a 60% chance that that woman will develop ovarian cancer during the course of her life. Thankfully, it's an uncommon gene. The vast majority of cases of breast cancer are not caused by the BRCA gene, but massively significant for the individuals and family where that gene is found. So there's a few principles about the etiology of cancer. The next podcast we're going to think about how we can transpose this thinking into how cancer can be prevented. 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 Prevented.